There we go. All right. Again, my name is Elizabeth Hamilton and I'm with Holy Cow Consulting, and I am going to be walking through your data with you today. I always start out before we talk about the actual information, talking about why we do what we do, the way that we do it at Holy Cow Consulting. So the first is we go through the data and the report all together at one time. This is not because we have some sort of big surprise reveal in the data. It's because we know that first impressions are lasting impressions, and we want to make sure you walk away with the right first impression. The other thing we do is we benchmark. You benchmark in life all the time. You just don't call it benchmarking. So, for example, when you walk into a new cafe, you look around. Is it clean? Can you find a place to sit? Is it reasonably priced? And you compare it to other dining experiences you've had. Is better? Maybe it's the same, or maybe it's not as good. The same is true when you meet a new group of people. Is it warm and welcoming, or do they feel a little bit closed off? And you compare it to other times that you've met new people as better, the same, or maybe it is not as good. Benchmarking helps us understand kind of what is typical, what's exceptional, or what's a growth opportunity. So when we look at your data, we benchmark you against 2,800 other congregations we've worked with in the last 6 years. Why is this helpful? We know the trends in the churches that have been growing over the last 3 years. Or 4 years, we have watched how the data has moved post-COVID. And by the way, it only moved in 2 places in our data set, which has been very interesting. We have pulled out and looked at generational data to see what are the different needs in the different generations. So I'm going to be able to bring all of that to the forefront as we talk about what we see today with you all. The other thing that benchmarking does is it helps us understand what is scalable or doable. So for example, I have a little niece named Charlotte, and she likes to send me these little things to crochet for her. And benchmarking lets me know what's within my skill set and when do I need to reach out to somebody else for help. So benchmarking is really helpful for us to build understanding. We work to listen empathetically. When members of your parish sat down and took this assessment, they took it from their experiences and from their hearts. Their experiences might be different than the leaders that are on this call, and we want to make sure we hold space to listen to them. We lean on good research practices. And the last piece is, I know your data. I've spent a lot of time going through your reports, but I don't know your story. And so I am hoping that where there's some space to have some conversation, we have it. If you have questions as I'm explaining things, or if something doesn't fully connect with you, please interrupt me and say, I'm sorry, can I ask a quick question? Or just if you could point this out to me. If you're not understanding what I'm explaining, I'm pretty sure then there's somebody else on the call who is not understanding it either. And what I want to make sure we do is walk away with a really good understanding of the data, because there's a lot for us to go through tonight. You're not going to understand all of it this evening. My job is to teach you how to look at the report. So as you can look at the reports moving forward, maybe even 6 months, a year to 2 years from now, it makes sense to you. Okay. There are 3 things that any church wants in a transition. The first is to be that ready church. So what are the things we need to be working on during this time to be a congregation that can follow the leadership of your rector without being sidetracked by conflict or controversy or things that we have not addressed? We want that right clergy. You want a clergy person is a good fit for who you are and where you want to go, or more importantly, where God has called you to go, for that running start. So you have that beginning with your new rector where there are a few surprises on the other side, and we're moving forward to do what you were called to do as a church. So those are 3 different buckets that we're going to talk about tonight. You all ordered a lot of sub-reports. And so we're going to talk about those sub-reports tonight, and I'm going to overlay them with your overall report in the places that make sense to build understanding. So let's talk about your reports. First, you did a breakout by worship service. For 8 a.m. worship, you had 19 respondents. For 10 a.m. worship, you had 90 respondents. 8 people who responded to this have attended both services. Then we have our tenure reports. You have 4 years and under tenure, and that's 18 respondents. You have 5 to 10 years of tenure, and that is 19 respondents. You have 11 to 20 years of tenure, and that was 20 respondents. And then for over 20 years tenure, you had 63 respondents. But wait, there's more. We have other reports. We also broke this out by ages. So you have your 54 and under, how did they respond? And that's 26 respondents. Ages 55 to 64 was 15 respondents, and 16.5 and over was 75 respondents. Now you're probably looking at this and saying, okay, lady from Holy Cow, why did you break out with these age groups? We try to find the smallest subgroup that we can get where it's still statistically significant enough that the information is actually valid. What we don't want to do is give you a report where 3 people responded, right? So these were kind of the smallest groups that we could get into, 54 and under, then 55 to 64, and then 65 and over, which was your largest group by far. So the goal in all of this, again, is to help you understand the differences so that you can lead well. The goal is not to get into the point where we are at analysis paralysis, right? We can get to the point where we dig into the data so much we no longer even know what to do with it. So again, my goal tonight is to help you understand how to look at it, knowing that you're going to come back to it, and especially the places that are really important for you all to understand. So we are going to start out and we are going to do the overall vital signs for Trinity Episcopal Church. And then like I said, in the parts that are important, I'm going to pull in the sub-reports. So we're going to start on your key indicators page, which is going to be page 4 of your report. Before we start talking about the data, I want to kind of talk about a few things with you. First of all, if you look at your bottom corner, you had 127 people take this assessment. That is 70% of your response rate. You're just a little outside of that 5% margin of error, but still in a good place to use this data to drive decision making. At the top right, you see an owl, and that references back to the book Owl Site that was sent with your report. Robert, I'm going to send a PDF of it as well when I send your PowerPoint out to you. But what is helpful to know here, for those of you that want to go and read a little bit more, this book was written to complement the Vital Signs report and is there for you to help build understanding. Before we actually go over the information, I want to talk about 2 main things. The first is what we measure right away in our Vital Signs report, and that is satisfaction and energy. When we talk about satisfaction, this is not a sense of shallow satisfaction you get when you order something from Amazon and it hits your front porch. This is something much deeper. It's your sense of peace, it's fulfillment, it's wholeness, it's belonging, it's meaningful relationships, and absence of discord. It is that sense of shalom when you are all together at Trinity Episcopal. The other thing we look at is your level of energy, that compelling sense of purpose, that force of engagement. It is passion lined up with intention, that moving together with that collective vision and mission. So those are 2 things that are really critical to look at for any congregation. The other thing, when we look at your responses, we're going to talk about 3 different categories. The first are your clearly agreeing people. Those individuals have definitively said yes. They strongly agree or they agree. On the other side, we have clearly disagree. Those individuals have definitively said no. They disagree or they strongly disagree. In the middle, we have our on the fencers. They tend to agree. They tend to disagree. They're kind of maybe sort of yes, kind of maybe sort of no, but they've not made a decision as to where they're at. Oftentimes they are watching and waiting to see what happens next before they make a decision. During the political season, you would call these people your swing voters because they are movable. So as we look at your data today, it's going to be important for us to look at who is on the fence, because these individuals are more likely to move depending on what happens next in the church. All right, so now we're going to actually talk about the data. So on a whole, for your satisfaction, on a whole, I am satisfied with how things are in our church. 35% agreed, 55%, so over half of your respondents were on the fence, 10% clearly disagreed. The rating of church satisfaction level in the benchmarking is average or typical. For overall energy, we ask a negatively framed question. So with a negatively framed question, you want disagreements to it. There are 12 of these questions throughout the tool. The one for energy is, it seems to me that we are just going through the motions of church activity. There isn't much excitement among our members. 15% clearly agreed, 51% were on the fence, so that half again, and 34% disagreed. Your rating of church energy level was average or typical. For your attendance trend, compared with 3 years ago, I attend worship, 25% said less. We're going to call these people backdoor people later on in the report when we look at them a little bit more. So 25% said less, 56% said they're attending about the same, and 19% said more. There's an actual breakout on page 26 of how much more and how much less these people are attending, and we'll look at that later on as we go through this information. But you have an average annual change in attendance of a negative 2%. Value of activity beyond worship. On a whole, participation in church activities is very meaningful to me. 54% clearly agreed, 39% were on the fence, and 7% clearly disagreed. Your rating of church activity beyond worship is lower than we typically see, so below the 30th percentile in our benchmarking. So let's talk about your top 3 priorities. So I put the top one here in the middle, and it is growth focused, and it is make necessary changes to attract families with children and youth to our church. The second is also a growth focused priority, which is pretty typical for most churches we work with. And it is a 3-part strategy. The first part is to create and implement a comprehensive strategy. So that's the first part. The second part is to reach new people. And the third part is to incorporate them into the life of the church. That third part we sometimes struggle with and can get a little tricky in churches. We want the new people to come in, but then making sure that we are making space for them on our committees to bring their new ideas, their new energy, and maybe having some flexibility as a church to engage in some of those. Making sure that we are being hospitable when people come in and not kind of connecting with the same people we talk to when we come to worship. That third part, incorporating them into the life of the church, is really important because we know nationally that people are lonely, and a lot of people who are coming into churches are feeling that sense of wanting to connect with others. Your third priority was to provide more opportunities for Christian education and spiritual formation at every age and stage of life. By the way, this is not just Christian education for the little kids, right? It's every age and stage of life. So usually I will ask, have in the past, why is growth important at Trinity? And I usually get the same things from different churches that I work with. You need growth to be viable. We want to bring in new energy. We've got a lot of things we want to do. We need people to help with that. And I've started pivoting recently to talk a little bit more about what we know about growth from the data. So just what the data tells us about growth. One, the churches that we've seen, the 10% that we're seeing grow in our database, and they are, by the way, mainstream denomination churches, they need to have internal health. So managing conflict, strong trust in leadership, really strong hospitality scores. We need to be internally healthy and make sure that we are able to engage each other and show the love of God to each other before we're trying to show it with others that we want to bring into the church. That we're understanding the needs of the population that we are trying to engage to have come to church. We oftentimes say that we want families with children and youth. What age group is that, right? You're generally looking at the lower end of Gen Xers and millennials and younger. What we know about millennials and younger is a lot of them are longing for connection, to be seen and honored for who they are. Sometimes they're looking for increased pastoral care because they're struggling with their own mental health. So there's a lot to think about with understanding needs. And after tonight, I'm going to send Robert a link to a blog of ours that has taken what we've been collecting since 2019 around the different generations and breaks it out in different categories to read more and learn a little bit more. But the differences in generations is really important to understand. The last piece is the number one change that we saw around growth post-COVID was around hospitality. People are really longing for that strong hospitality and connection. Churches with an 80% hospitality score and higher are the ones that we see growing because people want to feel that sense of connection when they're together. So those are three things that we know are really important. So when we talk about growth, these are three things that we want to make sure that we are kind of focused on. But also we want to make sure that we are focusing on these things anyways, because we want to be caring for each other well. Does this make sense? I'm going to look for head nods in the room. Okay. All right. So the next thing that we're going to talk about on your next page are your drivers. Drivers are unique to every church. It is what people are looking for in their church experience. They're unique to your church. They'll be different than other churches. A good example for this, which is written here on this page, is when I go purchase a car, because I'm a mom of 2 kids, I'm going to be looking for something very different than I looked for when I was 20 years old, right? I need more space in the trunk of my car. Safety is more important to me. I don't necessarily care how cool the car looks because I'm going to be putting my kids in it who are going to create things that are messy. Everyone's looking for different things when they purchase a car. Same thing is true for a church. When people come to church, there are different things that impact how satisfied or energized they are. So what we do is we take the 85 questions that you responded to, we run a correlation to figure out of those 85 things, what has the greatest impact on you feeling satisfied or energized? What has the strongest correlation? The list on this page is not necessarily what you're doing well, it's what people are focused on. What helps me is to write above it, members of Trinity are satisfied when these things are happening. So let's look at your drivers for satisfaction. The first is around the priest in charge. Our priest in charge articulates a clear vision for our church and keeps it before the people in a compelling way. It has a high degree of focus. So when this is happening well, this is going to bring your sense of satisfaction up. The second is the whole church spirit in our congregation makes people want to get as involved as possible. This is a morale driver. And when we feel this whole spirit and wanting to be as involved as possible, that is going to have a high impact on how satisfied we feel. Your third driver, our priest in charge makes things happen. And that also has a high degree of focus. The next is around your leadership. The leaders of our church show a genuine concern to know what people are thinking when decisions need to be made. That also has a high degree of focus. Number 5 is around gift discernment, so readiness for ministry. And that is our church prepares our members for ministry by helping them discern their gifts. That also has a high degree of focus. So we have 2 that are focused on our priest in charge, so that rector focus. Then you have 1 on morale, you have 1 on leadership, and 1 on gift discernment. When it comes to your drivers of energy, you only had 1 for your entire vital signs report. Once we do the breakout in the different groups, you see other things for energy popping up. But for the overall congregation, you just had 1, and it was on morale. And that is the whole spirit in our congregation makes people want to get as involved as possible. What was interesting when we did the breakout around drivers is those who are under 54 are clergy focused. Their drivers are very focused on around the rector or your priest in charge. The other groups, tenure, age, what worship service you attend, just have different drivers that they're looking for. So we're going to talk a little bit later about some things to do or be mindful of when we have that focus on your rector, because there are things that we want to make sure that we are shoring up with that age group. But in general, these were the drivers that we saw for your overall congregation. Are there any questions on this? So when you go and look at these sub-reports later on, which if you print them all out, it's going to be, I think, a couple hundred pages. So I wouldn't necessarily do that. I would just look at them on your computer if possible. What you're looking for with all of these is kind of what are we focused on to help us feel energized or satisfied, because it helps you know what people are looking for in their church experience. Does this make sense?
Elizabeth,
Yes. I can't hear you if you're talking. I'm sorry.
I
Probably too far away from the microphone in the church.
Yeah.
we were muted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, this is from Char Burgess, who's a community leader and an active member of our church. She says, in light of today's church attendee who is seeking friendships and seemingly quotes almost entertainment, how does a church, which is a bit more traditional, such as us, go about seeking new members?
Yeah. So I think we need to kind of talk a little bit about church culture, which is later on in the report, before we talk about that too much, and where you're at with your performance indices.
Right. Good.
Because there are some things internally that you're going to want to work on before we think too much about initiatives to engage people and bring them in. Any other questions around drivers? Yes, please.
The written report is different than what is up on the screen. An explanation or?
The written report is different than what's up on the screen?
Yes. Like
For your overall vital signs report?
Yes, like the drivers, page 5 of the vital signs.
Yeah.
It's got 5 different drivers for the drivers of energy.
You're looking at the one for the overall vital signs report? Not the breakout by age or tenure or worship time?
Correct. Am I the only one that's seen this difference?
Hi, Opie. Yeah, we all have a report that looks like the one on the screen.
I think, Hopi, you may have.
I couldn't hear the last part of that.
This one, it's both services.
I think you have the one that says both services, not
Both
the one that
worship
says,
times.
not that says, there's an overall vital signs report.
Yeah.
So you have it on your computer, but it may not be the one you have in front of you.
Both services. Okay.
That's what you have, but you should have the one that says, vital signs for Trinity Episcopal Church presented from congregation, the congregational assessment tool, that's all. It doesn't have an age group or a tenure.
Yes, that's true. And it's for both worship times.
No, you got the wrong report. That's
Oh,
the-
okay.
Yeah,
So-
okay, so you're looking at, so this is, yeah, so the great thing is first of all, pulling out all of these sub-reports was incredibly wise. You all have some unique differences in these different groups, and you don't know what they are till you pull the sub-reports.
Gotcha.
Oh, good. But what I will say, hopefully, is that is like one of, I don't know if anyone else has this when they do any kind of report where they're always afraid they have the wrong piece of information they're reporting on. But what's going to be really important is that you understand what this page means, because you have some differences in all of the different groups. And again, we don't want to get to the point where we have analysis paralysis, but we do want to make sure that we're building strong understanding, because there are some differences. And what I will tell you all, spoiler alert, you're very theologically diverse with how you look at the 4 things that we look around theological bend. There are some differences, and those differences pop up in your reports. And so with all of that, it's just going to be important that you understand how to look at this, so that when you go back to look at the individual reports, you know how to read them. So if you're saying, okay, we want to start reaching out to the families with children and youth, let's look at what the members that are currently here are longing for and understand that, because if we're meeting their needs well, then maybe they might be more comfortable bringing their friends to church, right? So again, what's important is that we understand how to read it, so that as you dig into these other reports down the road, you know how to look at things. All right, Hopi, are we on the same page now?
We're
And
on
same
the
report?
same page. Thank you.
Perfect. That's what I love to hear.
Really.
All right. So it's really important when we think about where we want to go and what we want to do. We start out with where we are, the direction we want to move in. And so it's really important as we think about where we're at for energy and satisfaction, which we're going to talk about next, what your drivers are, and then some of the things people are longing for to be maybe a little bit different. We understand and can kind of carve out that path. So I want to talk to you about our energy and satisfaction map. And I'm going to go over each of these quadrants before we talk about where you all are and then the different reports, because we know that churches move. Where you are today is not where you were 2 years ago. It's not where you're going to be 3 years from now. Churches move all over this map. And so I'm going to talk about each quadrant because it's important for you to understand them before we talk about where you all are tonight and then where you are in all the different sub-reports. So I'm going to start up here in the top left, and that is the chaos quadrant. These churches are high energy but lower satisfaction. Appropriately named, they're incredibly energized and excited by the different things that they're working on. Sometimes we see when churches have gone through a stagnant period and then they're starting to re-engage in different programming and new things they're doing, we'll see them pop into chaos for a little bit because they're energized around that. But what we don't want to do is stay here. We want to make sure that everything we're doing has alignment, so that all of the programs we're engaged in, all the different ministries, all the different parts of the life of the church have a collective vision and mission that they're moving towards together to avoid any kind of conflict that can occur with budget line items, space, or volunteers, right? Because we don't want our programs within the church to feel like they're in conflict with each other. We want them to feel like they are moving together, even if they're doing different things, right? In the top right, we have the transformational quadrant. These churches are higher energy, higher satisfaction. These churches have a strong collective vision and mission for who they are and where they're going together. They feel that sense of connection to each other. They're rooted in strong relationships. The top, when we talk about growth, the churches that are in the top area here are the ones that we see growing the most. Especially when they have strong hospitality scores, because that energy and that sense of connection permeates throughout the congregation. In the bottom right, we have the static quadrant. Those churches are lower energy but high satisfaction. They're really content with what they're doing, even when that programming is no longer bearing fruit. So it's really hard for them to engage in change because they're comfortable. One of my colleagues will refer to this type of church as someone who's in the best car possible. They have a great mocha latte, wonderful music on the radio, and no gas, right? So we're not necessarily going anywhere, but we're very content with where we're at. The problem is we know that change has to happen because things change, right? And so really getting them to move and do things differently is challenging. And at some point they will start to lose their energy to the point that new people do not feel the need to come in because they don't connect with the things that the church is working on. In the bottom left, we have the reinvention and recovery quadrant. These churches have lower energy and lower satisfaction. Maybe they've gone through some conflict, they've gone through different struggles, maybe they've had a loss, maybe they have a longing for things being the way they used to be. But these churches oftentimes are looking to do something a little bit different than where they're at now. Oftentimes what we'll see with churches that are reinvention recovery, when they want to do something different and they start to engage in new things, they don't generally just pop from down here in the bottom and go straight up to transformational. Oftentimes they'll pop up into chaos and then they'll move over, which can be a pretty typical pattern. So where we find you guys today is the reinvention and recovery quadrant, but very close to this area here, the chaos quadrant. But they're moving in this, you guys maybe are coming up from below here. We've come down, but this is kind of where you're at right now. What I will say when I did a breakout is you guys are all over the board with where you're at on these quadrants, but mostly in reinvention and recovery and a little bit in chaos. So your 8 a.m. is here. Your individuals who've got 4 years of tenure or less are higher up in chaos. So they're close to transformational. Those who've been with you for over 20 years are in this area right here. 10 a.m. is here, 8 a.m. is here. Those who attend both services are here. And those who've been with the church for 5 to 10 years is there. And I realized in the process of trying to make sure I got everybody on here, I missed somebody. And that are your individuals who've been with you for 11 to 20 years. So I am going to put them right here where they go. Apologize. I will get that fixed before I send this to you. So those who've been with you for 11 to 20 years are just over reinvention and kind of into chaos. So this is where we do the breakout based off of services and how long people have been with you all or tenure. When we do another breakout, and I didn't want to make this too cluttered, based on age, here's where we broke out based on age. So your 55-year-olds to 64-year-olds are in the transformational quadrant. Your 54 and under are right here in chaos, and your over 65 are right here in reinvention and recovery. Does this resonate with what you all know about where your church is right now? I feel like I'm seeing some head nods. Okay, thank you. And so the question then that gets asked is, what do we need to be doing to move into this transformational quadrant? What is it that we want to be addressing during this time to be that ready church, right? I talked at the beginning about being that ready church where we're in a good space to call your next rector. What are the things we want to be working on? Cynthia. Oh, okay. So on this page, we have your critical success factors.
Elizabeth, we have a question.
Oh, please, please, please.
The last slide,
Yes.
what is the red dot that's in the lower left quad? Yeah, that's that one.
Yeah, so that's your overall vital signs report.
Okay, because that's not in the same spot as the.
I know, and I apologize. When I did this and I copied and moved it over, it must have slid it down.
Okay.
Slides do that sometimes. I apologize for that. You guys, for your overall vital signs report, are right here.
Right, yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? Sometimes PowerPoint and I get into some discussions about images when I move them. Okay. So on the next page, we have your critical success factors for improving satisfaction. So what is it that people are longing for us to kind of pay attention to during this time? This is one area we're going to spend some time on tonight and really look at kind of the breakout for the sub reports. And again, I don't want to give you so much information that it's hard to understand, but there are some patterns that I think are important for us to talk about. So when you look at this, it's kind of a rating scale. So we do a 2-part analysis. We get your drivers by understanding kind of Pearson's R, then we run a second analysis to say, okay, what are the things that we need to be tending to as a congregation during this time? So when we look at this list, anything over 50 is urgent. You do not have anything over 50 for the overall congregation. You do have some things that are over 50 when we do the sub-reports, but nothing for the overall congregation. 35 to 50 is considered important. We want to address it soon. And 20 to 34 is considered significant. Let's talk about it soon. So the top one is that leaders are representative of membership. So that was the top critical success factor for improving satisfaction. The second is around gift discernment. So members discover gifts. That the spirit in the church makes people want to get as involved as possible is your third one. So that's morale focused. A friendly atmosphere prevails among the members of our church is this fourth one. Leaders seek input when decisions need to be made. That we feel prepared to welcome guests. That we have quality education for every age and stage of life. That we are resolving problems through mutual effort. That there's flexibility in our programs to meet my complex lifestyle. And the last one is that we are willing to change our worship to reach those others in the community. This is your overall list for the entire congregation. And I'll tell you, when I look at a list like this, I need to start breaking it into categories, right? And so I'm going to talk about those categories here in a minute because I broke them into 4 when I read through all of the critical success factors for all your sub-reports. But what we're going to do next is we're going to look at the breakout for the critical success factors based on some of your sub-reports. And I've circled the pieces that I think we want to pay attention to. The first is this group at 8 a.m. worship. They're looking for that spirit of involvement pops up higher for them. It's almost urgent. Leaders seeking input gets higher. Disturbing conflict comes up. And I will tell you this comes up on most of the sub-reports. So what I will tell you is what I saw throughout your data is there is either conflict that we're still working through now, or there's conflict that we have experienced, and it has kind of impacted a lot of the different parts of the congregation. This one, we welcome changes in worship, but clergy articulating a vision comes up for the first time in this subgroup. And then this one here, that there's a small minority of people who are in opposition to what the majority wants to do. So that's 8 a.m. worship. Let's look at the other reports and see what we see pop up. So for your 10 a.m. worship, theirs looked very much like the overall vital signs report, but conflict comes up, and there's a difference there. So when I looked at the other reports, and I'm going to show those too, here are kind of the 4 buckets that I saw. Because if I look at a list, especially as a leader, I kind of think, okay, this is now a list of things to tackle, and that can be overwhelming. But if I break it into groups, these are the 4 groups that I saw, because I always hate to put worship, by the way, in other buckets, because worship is worship. The first was around leadership. That leaders are representative of the membership and that we're seeking input. Now, this can be perception. We could be seeking input, but if people feel like their voices aren't being heard or their input's not being given and honored, we're missing there. The next is around relationships. And so I put conflict management here, and then how we're managing differences, how we're welcoming each other, and that friendly atmosphere prevailing among the members of the church. So there, I made a relationship bucket. The next I put around programming, and I put lifestyle. So making sure when we've got our programming that it meets the lifestyle needs of the people who want to attend, that we're helping with gift discernment and Christian education. And then the last bucket I created was around worship, because again, I always get hesitant to put worship in with other things, though it overlaps with everything. When you look at that list, do these 4 buckets make sense? Okay. All right. And we'll see later on in the report, but there is obviously something that we have gone through as a congregation, or we're going through, around conflict that has impacted, I would guess, a lot of your scores in the data tonight. All right, so those are kind of the buckets. I'm going to run through these real quick. So for your people who are new to the church, so 4 years of tenure or less, we want to make sure we pay attention to them, because as we're bringing new people in, we want to make sure the new people that have come in are also feeling comfortable in church. So their critical success factors reach higher numbers with what they need to have addressed. The first thing for them was welcoming changes in worship, that we're prepared to welcome guests, that we're willing to change our worship to reach others. So these are both about being more flexible as a congregation. Connecting with the preaching, worship being excellent drops down to 30, and that members feel called to ministry. So these are your new people and kind of where they're at and what they're looking for. If I move to your 5 to 10 years tenure, this is where we see conflict come up significant. So for them, that there's a disturbing amount of conflict in the congregation is in the mid 50s. And then they feel prepared to welcome guests. Is this surprising information or confirmation of what we thought we might see tonight? Anyone?
Hi, Elizabeth, we had a question. Which report is this and which page is it on?
This is 5 to 10 years tenure, and it's going to be on page 7. I wouldn't feel like you need to flip between the reports too much. I mean, you can. What's important here is to note, for the people who've been with you all for 5 to 10 years, this conflict piece comes up really strong for them. But it didn't show up for those who have been with you for less than 5 years. So my guess would be whatever conflict's being referred to is something that happened a while ago that we're still working through, or we've worked through and are healing and we're still healing.
Mhm.
Okay. And we don't have to dig into it unless you want to, but that's kind of what I saw. And so these things linger, we know they happen. Cynthia, did you have something?
No, I just had to get up.
Oh, please get up and move around. So,
A comment,
Yes.
Elizabeth. The 5 to 10 year people were here in a period of conflict.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's-
The four and less,
yeah.
the conflict had really started to, we were really working on getting that conflict resolved, I hope.
Right.
But
Yeah.
that's why you're not seeing it in the less than four and less, and you're seeing it highly in the larger group. And I hope we're seeing in the people who've been here longer, that they know we've been able to deal with conflict before, and maybe that's what, so that's, I sort of see where that's coming from. It's really interesting.
So that's, when we look at data, I don't know, like I said earlier, I don't know your story. So I look at this and I say, okay, I have a wondery here. If this is something that happened that we're moving through, and also we know that churches are built on relationships. And sometimes when those breaks happen, right, it takes time to come back and to heal and to continue to learn new ways to do things or to engage. So we know things hang. But what's important is that we're mindful of the fact that this is still here for people. So for 11 to 20, we've got this, the leader's representative of the membership is significant for them. Minority in opposition with what the majority wants to do is their second, and it's in the mid to higher 60%. That we're tolerant of differences. And then we've got the leadership thing here, pieces here with leaders seeking input, how we're making decisions, how we're resolving problems through mutual effort, and then disturbing conflict is in the kind of important arena. So, you know, again, these are your 11 to 20 year tenure, and this is kind of what is impacting their satisfaction level. And all of this is on page 7 for all of your different reports. So just as a reminder, and this is when I pulled the rest of them and looked at them, but these were the ones that I thought were the most important to bring to your attention, of some of the differences that I saw and some of the longing that they have for things that we want to make sure that we're paying attention to or tending to as leadership in the church, especially during this time of transition. And these might be things that we're already working on that are just still coming up in your data. Are there any questions on these things? Okay. And just as a reminder that God has great plans for you during this time. All right. So let's talk about your priorities. Where do you want to go? So we're going to move to page 8 on the report. It is the busiest page of our report, and together we're going to make it worse. All right, so you have this page for all these different groups within your congregation, which is really kind of cool. So you can at any point go back in and look at what the different priorities are for the different groups. So let's talk about how to read this page. So on the left, we have the ranking for the congregation. So your first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. In red, we have the benchmarking. And I have never had this. Every single one of your priorities fell in the typical range in the benchmarking. Usually there's something high, there's something low. You all fell in the average range for what you're longing for or for future priorities. Now, if you remember when you answered these questions, it was how much additional energy do you want placed in certain places? In the middle, we have what the priority is. And to the right, we have the mean score, with the highest mean that you can have being 5. We usually say look at a mean of 3 or higher because you can't do 17 things at one time. For you all, there are 9 priorities that people want additional energy placed towards. Doing 9 things is going to be really hard, right? So we're going to have to kind of pare down a little bit. But there are lots of things that you guys want to do. So let's look at after the third. If you remember, I said that the data moved in 2 places post-COVID. Here is one of them right here. So this 4th priority for you all was a 9th or 10th priority pre-COVID. And it is create more opportunities for people to form meaningful relationships. It's because people are lonely, right? We know that loneliness is not only a national epidemic, it's been considered a global epidemic, but people are longing for relationships. So as you think about any future planning that you do, make sure we are building in elements of relationship building. So when we're doing service work together, we're doing something, it doesn't have to be overly formal, but it has to be intentional on how we're helping people build relationships, especially people who are newer and maybe don't know everybody. But this is that call out. People want to build relationships with each other within the congregation, which is actually kind of cool, right? We're looking to go to church to get to know people. Your 5th priority is an external priority, and that is develop ministries that work towards healing those broken by life circumstances. The sixth, work to renew and revitalize the community around the church by building coalitions with partners. So we have another external. Seventh is develop the spiritual generosity of the people to financially support the ministry of the church. Eighth is strengthen the process by which members are called and equipped for ministry and leadership. And ninth is expand outreach ministries that provide direct services to those living on the margins of society. You guys have a really good mix here of internal and external priorities as a congregation. Do you see that? Like if we take out the first two, which are growth focused, this Christian ed is internal. This one's internal, but then this next one's external, external, internal, internal, external. So you've got a really nice balance. Sometimes when I work with churches, they're either all external or they're all internal, right? We can't do external work if we're not internally taking care of ourselves too. So you want that balance. Your 10th one is strengthen the management and support of persons in various ministries. 11 is work as an advocate for social and institutional change so society might better reflect the values of the kingdom of God. This one here and this one here, your 9th and 11th priority, what I will tell you is that nationally, those are two really big priorities for your millennials and younger. This younger generation wants to know how we are putting legs to the church and doing work outside the four walls of the church. Then we have the strengthen the pastoral response of the church, deepen our sense of connection to God and one another through stronger worship services, adapt the opportunities provided by the church, making them more accessible given the pace and schedule of my life. So this one's 14 for your overall vital signs report. Keep this in mind when we get to your next page. And then 15 is expanding the international mission of the church with financial resources and personal involvement. 17 was enlarge or improve the physical facilities of the church. And then the last one was around music. So again, you have this broken out for every different tenure group, age group, worship group, and all of the different reports you have. But we do have it broken out for you here based on age. And I put the number of respondents on here so that you can kind of get a good look. So 2% of your respondents were under 35, 33% were 35 to 64, and 65% were 65 and over. If you remember, your 14th priority is the first one for your over 35. Now, just a reminder, when you have a 2% response rate, they're going to be focused on particular things together because they tend to agree with themselves, right? 2% is not a huge population. So as we look at things, just remember that that's going to be skewed just a little bit. What helps me when I look at these pages and all your future breakouts is to say, okay, where are there commonalities and where are there differences, right? So this first one for your under 35, I put a U next to it because it's unique for them. Right here, their second priority, number 58, is one that they share with the 35 to 64. If you see, it's the second priority for 35 to 64. It is the third priority for 65 and over. So that is a commonly shared priority between those three groups, and that is around Christian education. The next priority that is shared between the other groups, all three groups, is 59 right here. It's shared here. It's the third one for 35 to 64, and it's the second one for 65 and over. After that, we disperse out with our priorities, which is why you had so many priorities with a mean of over 3, because we have diverse things that we want to do with the different groups. What's going to be really important for you all moving forward is that we work to bring in and line everybody up with what we're doing, because we can't go in 20 different directions. You can try, it's not a good idea, right? So moving forward, really making sure we've got that strong strategic vision for where we're going, that things line up and under. So let's focus again on your under 35. Their third priority which is expand outreach ministries that provide direct services to those living on the margins of society, is unique for them. So I like to put a U next to it. Their fourth priority, develop ministries that work towards healing those broken by life circumstances, is shared with the 35 to 64. So I usually put an S here, and then I'll put an S here. What I want to say is that developing ministries that work towards healing those broken by life circumstances is usually a priority that we see for 35 and over nationally in our database, because at a certain point in life, you realize if you've lived long enough, you're going to have experienced some life circumstances that are going to break you, right? Their fifth priority, work to renew and revitalize the community around the church by building coalitions with partners that share this vision and commitment, is also shared with your 65 and over. And this is not going to let me draw here. So now let's look at your 35 to 64s. Where are they unique and where do they have shared? So they have the make necessary changes to attract families with children and youth as their first priority. They share it with 65 and over, right? The 50, so here we have this create more opportunities for people to form meaningful relationships is shared with their 65 and over. By the way, it doesn't mean that this group is not interested in also building relationships. It wasn't their top 6. So that is shared between these two groups. So as you look at all of these reports moving forward, you're going to look for where they're unique, where are they shared, and then think about how we start to really pull things together. So again, we have that collective vision and mission as a church. The 6th priority for your 35 to 64 is unique to them. Strengthen the process by which members are called and equipped for ministry and leadership. So when we talk about the vestry, when we talk about leadership on committees, 35 to 64 are kind of doing a shout out here of we might be interested in being on leadership, but we might need some more kind of support with that onboarding process, right? Because being on vestry, running a committee, those things can be really overwhelming, especially if you've never done it before, even if you're in this age group, right? And then the only one now that we're missing is this 5th priority, develop the spiritual generosity of the people to financially support the ministry of the church. That is unique for your 65 and over. And it is a typical top priority for 65 and over that we see nationally. Because those who are 65 and over want to ensure that there's a legacy at the church and that things are still okay when they're no longer here. Does that make sense? Seeing some head nods. Okay. We're going to do one more breakout, and that is top priorities based on infrequent and frequent attenders. So only 13% of your respondents attend once a month or less. Now here's my shout out to the infrequent attenders. I am on the road so much in May, I am not going to be at my parish at all, right? So there are lots of different reasons that people can attend infrequently. It doesn't mean that they're less engaged or that they care less about the church. It just sometimes means that life gets in the way. So for your 13% or less, and then here we have our top priorities for your frequent attenders. So we like to go through and look to see, okay, where are there some commonalities and where are there some differences in these groups? And again, looking based on their number. So this make necessary changes to attract families with children and youth is also a top priority for your frequent attenders. Christian education is a priority for both, right? The comprehensive strategy to reach new people is a top priority for both. Here's where we see a breakout. This 4th priority for your infrequent attenders, develop ministries that work towards healing those broken by life circumstances. Create more opportunities for people to form meaningful relationships once again, is carried by both. And this 52 here, develop the spiritual generosity of the people to financially support the ministry of the church, is also unique to them. What I look for infrequent attenders is there are two priorities that I look for that I didn't see for you all. One is around pastoral care, so that's good. Usually when we have infrequent attenders and then that pastoral care piece pops up, it might mean that they're not able to attend church right now because of what they've got going on. And then maybe they don't feel cared for in the process. That was not a priority for you all, right? The other thing I look for is that flexibility in our programming. So for your frequent attenders, they're unique ones, or they're fifth and the sixth. Work to renew and revitalize the community around the church by building coalitions with partners that share this vision and commitment. And then the sixth one, strengthen the process by which members are called and equipped for ministry and leadership. So again, we have that call out there about how we feel called, and then how we're being onboarded, maybe mentored, trained, prepared to take on some of the leadership positions within the church. We're going to do one more breakout, or one more way of looking at priorities, and that is a bubble chart. So when you look at this page, the bigger the bubble, the bigger the priority it is. The smaller the bubble, the less of a priority it is. So like right here, look at these bubbles for music. The bubbles for music are incredibly small. And this is usually when, if the music director is on the call with me, I have to say, it's not because people don't care about the music. It's because needs are really being met by the music and worship, and they don't feel like extra energy needs to be put in that arena or in that area. So if you remember, only 2% of your respondents were under 35. That is in part why this bubble here around programs being accessible given their pace and schedule is so very big, right? Because it was only a small sample size. Here we have your back door, front door people. So 25% who said, I'm attending less in the last 3 years, and then 19% who said they've been attending more. And so I look to see, okay, where are some differences in these two groups? So for those who are attending less, they are prioritizing Christian education a little bit more. Relationships is just a little bit bigger for them than the front door people, right? And the front door people are the ones that are coming in the front door, they're attending more. Your front door people are a little bit more focused on reaching new people than the people who are disengaging. So what helps is when you look through this is to say, okay, where are there some commonalities between groups? Where are there some differences? Because we want to make sure that we're leveraging the spaces that we overlap and we're similar. Does this page make sense to people?
Yes,
Yeah, okay, good.
me it does.
So as you look at, again, you've got all these beautiful sub-reports, and kind of look, as you do your planning, thinking through too, again, where are there some differences and some need? And I always keep an eye out on this one right here around pastoral care. And when we see those bubbles pop up for different populations, and I don't know if you have a Stevens ministry at the church or lay leaders that have leaned into pastoral care, but making sure that we're being careful about that one too. So those are your overall priorities as a church. Are there any questions about that before we move on to church culture, which I think is going to be important for you? Well, I shouldn't say that because then you won't want to ask about priorities. Are there any questions about priorities? Okay. By the way, for those of you, especially in the big room, if you need to stand up and move around at all while I talk, I definitely believe movement's important. So please feel free to do so. All right. So who are we? What kind of was our culture as a church? So there are two things that we look at to help determine church culture. The first is around theological bent. So on this page, we have the explanation as to what we look at the top. In the middle, we have the statements as well as your response. So I'm going to put your on the fencers right here, these people in the middle. At the bottom, we have the theological perspective index, and we have more progressive, more conservative. This is only around theological bend. It has nothing to do with politics. It just looks at how we respond to these 4 statements. So I'm going to read the 4 statements to you. Converting persons to Christ must be the first step in creating a better society. Our congregation is committed to abide by the unchanging historic faith as handed down through the centuries. Scripture is the literal word of God without error, not only in matters of faith, but in historical, geographical, and other secular matters. The main purpose of Christian education is to help people know what is in the Bible. So when we look at your responses, something kind of cool happens. For this first one here, 9% strongly disagree and 8% strongly agree, 22% disagree, 16% agreed, and then you got a smattering of people on the fence. Your theological diversity is high, meaning you are over the 70th percentile in our benchmarking for where you land with these 4 statements. Is this confirmation of something you already knew, or is this new information? And by the way, this is not because you're Episcopalian. I've worked with a lot of Episcopalian churches that are average or even low in theological diversity, and some that are high. But this is something that's unique for your congregation. Is this something you all knew? Yes? Okay.
Mhm.
So then the question is, what does this mean? Well, it means a couple of things. First of all, it means that in any leadership position, you're going to need to be careful about ensuring that who you have is able to lead, preach, and teach a diverse group, inspiring growth and making people think without alienating them. That is a skill and a gift, right? So that is really important for you all to be aware of with your clergy, is that that's something that they're going to need to be able to do, and they're going to be able to need to straddle that line. What you all need to know as leadership is it means that people are worshiping together that feel differently about these 4 tenets of Christian faith that they disagree on. So conflict management and being able to hold space for differences is going to be critical in your congregation. Because we know that, yes, we've got some people on the fence, but we also have some people who are firmly rooted with where they're at. And we want to make sure, again, that we are able to honor each unique person in their path for where they're at. Does that make sense? So conflict management, how we're building up those skills, is going to be something we want to think about a lot. Any questions on this page before I talk about flexibility? Okay, by the way, we can always go back. I always come up with great questions like 15 to 20 minutes after we talk about a topic, right? So there's that grace there. All right, for flexibility, adaptability. This looks at the degree to which your church is willing to make adjustments in the way that you go about your ministry. So we look at 4 different things with flexibility. They kind of break out 2 by 2. The first 2 are members welcome changes in worship. By the way, notice it's our members welcome changes, not that I welcome changes, right? It's about how do we as a community welcome changes. And then our church tends to stay very close to the established ways of doing things. When we look at those 2 responses, you all are more settled than you are adaptable. The second 2, we are willing to adapt our worship to the needs and circumstances of the people we want to reach in our local community, pairs with our church changes its program from time to time to meet the changing needs of its members. Those 2 we want to make sure we have a balance on, because if we are willing to make changes to bring new people in, but we're not willing to make changes for people we're already worshiping with and already in our community, that can create some feelings. So we take these 2 scores and we put you on this map. And what I will tell you is, I not only looked at your sub reports, but then I went through and played with some of your raw data. You guys kind of have scatter plot going in this general area. You've got some people who are way down here. We got some people who are up here. We've got some people who are in this area, but you kind of straddle between performance and paraclete. Your overall vital signs report has you in this area here. So you are a paraclete church with a subculture. I'm going to talk about what paraclete is here in a minute, but it's important for you all to know that we've got different groups that are going to kind of have different things that they're looking for and looking at. And the people who are in this area are going to think very differently right here than the people in this area, right? So let's talk about the paraclete culture. From the book of John, it means advocate, and paraclete culture at its best. So this is what we have seen over the last 30 years, 40 years of running data. These are some characteristics we see in these churches. They develop communities that are intellectually open and reflective, but they also pay attention to structure and ritual. It is common to hear conversation about hospitality, inclusiveness, and spiritual practice within these churches. When I talk to a paraclete church, if I ask them what's something you love about your church, the word inclusion comes up really quick because it's something that they talk about a lot. It's really important to them. They are comfortable with the unique spiritual path that each individual must follow, but believe there are important patterns to spiritual practice. They are uniquely equipped to focus on ministries of healing. Hand-to-hand healing or engaging in frontline work is something that these churches can do incredibly well. And when their community is warm and hospitable, it can be a haven for those in need of healing or recovery. So one of the things that we'll see sometimes with paraclete churches is they will engage with communities that are struggling or have experienced trauma. Like they'll have a homeless ministry, so people who are homeless feel comfortable coming into worship, and we will see those individuals start to become part of the congregation. So it's not just about providing a service to those, but then bringing them in as part of their community as well. They prepare members to deal with the harshness of cultural and political realities in ministry. And they maintain a sufficient level of flexibility to prevent from becoming irrelevant to the thinking of those in the community around them. Does this resonate with you all? Some characteristics that you see in your church? Okay, I'm seeing head nods. One of the things I will say is that there are some pockets in your church that really struggle with that flexibility, and they've moved into a very settled part in your church. One of the things that you'll need to work on as a congregation is how do we engage in incremental change, not tons of change, but incremental change over time to get to kind of where we want to go. But really helping to build up some of those skills or some of that muscle, that flexibility muscle. All right, so we talked about your strengths. What are some shadow sides that we see for paraclete cultures? Now, it doesn't mean that all of these things are happening in your church. These are just some things that we sometimes see. So if missional focus is lost, sometimes paraclete cultures find themselves going through the motions of set routine rather than finding a deeper meaning. So we do what we do because this is the way we do it, and we've kind of lost sight of the why we do what we do the way we do it, right? So making sure that we really are clear on what our missional focus is as a church. We talk about burnout a lot. We've talked about burnout nationally a lot in the last 4 years. For your culture, it is a critical conversation. Paraclete cultures burn out more than the other 3 cultures that we work with. So you have to watch the temptation to overcommit to meeting the needs of others to the extent that there is burnout. And this is in 2 different ways. This is burnout because we take on too much programming and we want to do too many things because we see the need. It is also individual burnout when we talk to people within the church who have needs and we want to meet their needs too. So we're meeting their needs programmatically, we're also meeting their needs personally, and we burn ourselves out. And so really making sure that there are strong boundaries is really important because you want to be careful around that. Sometimes these churches can get trapped in the acceptance of where people are at without adequate levels of accountability that will help make them whole. So let me give you an example. Let's say, now I got to make up a name. I hope there's no one named Amelia on vestry or leadership. If there is, I'm so sorry. But let's say Amelia, when Amelia has thoughts or opinions on something, they always come to the forefront. So we have a vestry meeting, Amelia's on vestry, and even though it's not on the agenda, Amelia brings up the things she's very upset about, completely sidetracks the meeting. We end up in a conversation that we didn't plan on being in. We don't get the other agenda items dealt with. And then Amelia leaves feeling like I got it off my chest, but the whole meeting was kind of taken to the side. And everyone goes, well, that's just Amelia being Amelia. Instead of having that conversation with the individual to say, hey, listen, this is how we do practice. And when these things happen and you engage in this way, this is the outcome. We all have growth opportunities in life. I have a whole bucket of them, right? So when we see people act in ways that can cause disruption in the church or harm, we want to make sure we are putting down boundaries as to what is acceptable behavior. Jesus did it all the time in the New Testament, right? It's hard though for paraclete cultures because we really want to be inclusive and meet people where they're at. We want to meet them where they're at, but then we also want to walk them to where they need to be, right? The power of the gospel to transform must remain a focus in these cultures and not just the power to comfort. The power to comfort is incredibly powerful in the gospel, and so is the transformative power. So it kind of goes back to what I was just saying about that accountability piece and really thinking through how do we help people continue to heal and grow. So those are some things that we see, some struggles we see in paraclete churches. I don't know if you've seen these in your church, if these resonate at all, or if you have any questions. Okay. So let's talk about clergy needs. That's the really important question in all of this, right? What do we need to be thinking about for a rector? So here's some things that we've found to be really important for clergy. Really good at missional alignment and clarity. Because we can't do all the things. We want to do all the things as a paraclete culture, but we can't do them all. So making sure that you have someone that helps with missional alignment and clarity and can then set down those boundaries for the things that maybe are down the road, but not now. They have experience or training in assessing the effectiveness of programming in ministries because sometimes we need to let things go. They can support boundary setting and managing conflict in healthy ways. Sometimes with paracletes, we struggle with sharing our faith stories in a way that feels authentic and comfortable to us, yet we want to grow, right? So making sure that we have someone that can help you all feel comfortable sharing your faith stories while deepening your spiritual walk might be really important for you all. We've talked about the ability to teach and train a diverse congregation. That's also going to be important. I left this one in here. This is not one that I saw as much in your data, but one of the things that paraclete cultures oftentimes have to make sure they're careful about is not getting too internally focused, because sometimes even though we want to do community work, paracletes get really focused on what's happening on inside the church and lose sight of kind of that bigger vision. But those are some things that we know for paraclete churches are important for them to look for in their clergy. Any questions on this? Is this clear? Another thing that I wanted to put in here for you all, because we have that high theological diversity, here are some healthy system musts that we want to make sure that we are shoring up within your church. So these are some things to make sure that we are tending to, we are investing in. The first is around accountability, agency, and leadership skills. How are we building those things up? When you have a committee or vestry things that the vestry can make the decision on and move things forward, they are able to do that. They have that sense of agency. And that, again, there's that accountability. When we say we're doing things as leaders, we're getting them done. That strong trust and governance is incredibly important. High level conflict management skills are also really important. And what I will say is I, as a social worker, have taken a lot of training on conflict management, and it is a practice, right? I've never taken a training and been like, that's it, I'm going to implement this every time perfectly. In fact, what I do is I learn the things, and then a week later, I do it the way I've always done it, which is not the right way to do it. Anyone, I don't know if anyone else has had that experience, but it is a practice, right? It's a practice in grace, because we are again kind of moving into those places together, and continuing to grow. The last, we know that church systems are very much like family systems, and when there are transitions, anxiety pops up. There's concern about where we're going, what does the future look like. So making sure that we are managing that anxiety well, and we come from a place of abundance in what we do and God's blessings, and not from a place of scarcity. So those are 4 things to continue to think about. What do we want to make sure we are shoring up? These things also very much line up with some of your critical success factors that we laid out earlier. So I'm not giving you a whole new list. They very much line up with what we talked about earlier. Are there questions about this one? Okay. So I talked about flexibility a little bit ago. It is a vital part of any congregation. And here we have the whole church watching with nervous anticipation as the visitors sat where the Martins have sat for 42 years, right? We want to make sure that we are continuing to think about how are we flexible. And by the way, if you don't think I have a pew, I do. I sit in the same place every week. But yeah. All right. Are you guys doing okay, or do you need a 5 to 10 minute break?
Took my break. It was thunder, lightning, and hail.
Oh goodness.
Oh yeah.
We
All
get
right,
wind.
Trinity, how are you guys doing in the big room? Do you need to take a break?
Yeah, we're gonna take a 5-minute break would be great.
All right, perfect. My voice would appreciate that too. All right, everybody. We'll get together at 30 after, well, it's going to be 7:30 my time. I can't do the math. I think it's 4:30 for you now. All right. Okay, thanks everybody for hanging in there with me so far. So now we're going to talk about how we're doing your performance indices. And just kind of a quick sample with benchmarking. So you're about to see a dashboard that rates the different areas that we look at. We look at 8 of them. And for the 8 there, we're going to do a kind of a deeper dive into the questions that go into the rating scale for each area. But just this is an overall benchmarking. So 0 to 10 is very low, 10 to 30 is low, average is 30 to 70, high is 70 to 90, and very high is 90 to 100. So in this example here, we have the score of 44. It means that this church was higher than 44% of the other churches in the benchmarking, but there was an opportunity for growth of 56%, or yeah, 56%. So this is just going to give you an idea of where you guys are. So we're going to start with your overall vital signs report. Now, when we look at this, and this is why I said I think the conflict you guys have experienced has probably hit the different areas of the church, because we know for most of the church cultures that we work with, there's one that you guys are not, where if there's conflict, it doesn't tend to impact things. But for paraclete cultures, when we do have that kind of break with each other, it does impact other areas of the life of the church. What I look for here, so conflict management, we're at a 14%, governance, we're at a 25. We know in the data is when there's a conflict or a break in the church, it hits your governance score first, and then it hits your conflict score second. And then governance scores start to recover earlier than your conflict management. So if this is something that we've experienced or working through and continuing to kind of not necessarily get over, but get through together, then this would be an indication here that we are starting to kind of pull back out of it. So for your score for hospitality, we were at a 33. For morale, we're at 36. Conflict management, we're at 14. Governance is 25. Spiritual vitality at 29 for a paraclete culture. We tend to see with magi and paracletes, because this is an area that they tend to not be as comfortable kind of talking about or thinking about as much, because they get a little bit more in their heads. We do sometimes see these scores be a little bit lower. Worship and music, though, we have really high scores for that. And then the engagement and education, and that's probably where that longing for that priority comes up. So this is one area that we are going to look at the different breakout of their reports, because we do see some different experiences in the different subgroups. So what we're looking for is kind of a change of 10% or more when we look at these different groups. And I'm going to flip through this so you can see the movement. So here's your overall vital signs report. And you see for 8 a.m. worship, their hospitality goes up, conflict management comes up a little bit, spiritual vitality goes down a little bit, worship and music goes up a little bit higher, readiness for ministry goes a little bit higher. Let's look at 10 a.m. Hospitality goes down for 10 a.m. Conflict governance does, spiritual vitality comes up a little bit, readiness for ministry, worship and music also is down a little bit as well. Here's for both services. So I thought this was interesting. Look at the hospitality score for both services. It's at 72. And I don't know if anyone has any thoughts as to the individuals who are attending both service. I mean, that's quite a big jump. And then spiritual vitality, look at this, they're at 95. And I know it's a small group, but still. Four years of tenure. And this is kind of where they're at. Their morale is at 71, so that's a really strong score. Hospitality is at 41. Conflict management is at 58, so right in there in the typical or normal range. Governance is a little bit lower. Could be that they haven't met people on vestry. They're kind of unaware. Spiritual vitality is at 40. And I think this, again, Robert, to what you were saying earlier, that the conflict we experienced was, back before. So people who've only been with us for 4 years were not kind of a part of that, and maybe have experienced some of the healing. But that kind of falls in line with that a little bit. 5 to 10 years, we see that conflict pop down, governance, spiritual vitality, though, for those who've been with you guys for 5 to 10 years, again, really high. Worship and music, we're at 80 percentile. Readiness for ministry, really high for those.
I have a question.
Yes.
You said that there is music in 8 o'clock service.
No, it's worship and music.
Okay, but there is no music at 8 o'clock service.
Because it's a
There is-
right one. So what we see with those first right services, the 8 a.m. service, is what the statement is that we look at is around, and you'll see it when we get to that question, is that their needs are being met there. So they're responding to that piece with their needs being met. And that's why that score is so high, even though there isn't music, right? All right. So you're over 20 in the vital signs report. And this is where they're at with conflict management, governance, hospitality. Worship and music is at 86%. So if we do a breakout then again with all of this, as you can see, and I'm going to just flip through real quick. So watch your eyes. Do you see this movement happening? We've got some different experiences happening within these different breakout groups. Do you see that? So different groups are having different experiences in the church, whether they've been around for a while and have these long established relationships because they've been in the church for 20 years. maybe they were only been with you all for 10 years. So just again, as we look at this, knowing that people are coming to worship and coming to their services and coming together at Trinity with some very different experiences. And just again, to continue to work on how do we unify, how do we continue to build relationships across different spaces of tenure and age. This is when I say, church is one of the only times where you have intergenerational interactions, right? Outside of work, it's one of the few places where you have intergenerational relationships. And wow, we have a lot we can learn from each other. So again, how do we continue to cultivate those relationships across the board at Trinity? All right, so we are going to dig into the different areas and kind of looking at, okay, hospitality with those 5 questions, how do they break down? So for very low is 10 to 20, low is 10 to 30, average is 30 to 70, high is 70 to 90, very high is 90 and above. So as I said earlier tonight, and I think it bears repeating, hospitality and growth are connected. We know that churches that want to grow really want to invest in their hospitality. It needs to be authentic because people are looking for connection. We also know, as we've gone through different things in our relationships as a church, that can impact different areas. So again, kind of thinking about how do we support strong hospitality. Our churches that have a hospitality score of 80% or higher are the ones that we see growing, 90% and over the ones that we see growing the most by about 2% a year. All right. So there are 5 things that we look at hospitality. The first, our church welcomes and is enriched by persons from many different walks of life. A little bit of disagreement, some on the fence, but 31% agreed and 37% strongly agreed. You are in the 70th percentile in the benchmarking. Now you might say, hold on a second. We had 68%, 69% agree with this. Why are we not at 100% in the benchmarking? It's because you are benchmarked against churches that maybe 60% strongly agreed that they are enriched by persons from many different walks of life, right? So the benchmarking is not just looking at your scores, it's your score in comparison to the 2,800 other churches we've worked with in the last 6 years. But as a paraclete culture, this one's going to be really important to you all. The next, being part of this church community has given new meaning to my life. We are in the typical or average range for that question. A friendly atmosphere prevails among the members of our church, and this is where we first pop down in our hospitality scores into the low range. I sense an atmosphere of genuine care and concern among our members in times of personal need. And this last one, members in our church have been prepared to personally welcome guests in worship services. If you remember, you're those with lower tenure, with the under 5-year tenure. This is an area that they have a longing for a little bit more support. Welcoming people who might or might not be guests to church can be awkward because we're always scared. What if I introduce myself and I've already talked to them twice, right? We've all had that moment of like, there's a guy at church I never get his name right. I know it begins with a B. I've got that down. So, it gets awkward, and sometimes people need a little bit extra support, or maybe some encouragement of, hey, if you introduce yourself to the same person twice, it's okay, right? But sometimes we need that extra support. So that's where that longing kind of comes up. So this is where we are on hospitality. You indexed at 32, 33%. You're in the typical or average range. Morale and yes. Is there a question? Okay. Morale, there are 3 things that we look at. This is about your passionate, persuasive engagement of members and the mission of the church. What are we doing together as a collective community? And so it's just how we are engaging. It is a long-term strategy. With hospitality, we can continue to work on some things and see these scores jump rather quickly. For morale, it takes longer. It's a long-term investment. So the first statement is negatively framed. You're going to see an asterisk next to it. So we want disagreements. We want a shorter bar. It seems to me we're just going through the motions of church activity. There isn't much excitement among our members. And again, we've talked about this question earlier. We got a lot of movable people here on the fence about that. The whole spirit in our congregation makes people want to get as involved as possible. This is one of your drivers. This is something that really impacts how energized and satisfied people feel at your church. We are in the, again, the typical or average range, but at the very kind of bottom part of that. On a whole, I'm satisfied with how things are in our church. Again, we've got a lot of people on the fence. They're watching and waiting to see what happens next before we make a decision. Overall, for your morale score, you are in the mid 30th percentile. All right, the next thing that we look at is conflict management. And this is when I say responsibly as a social worker, conflict is normal. It happens in every marriage. It happens in every family. It happens with yourself in your head sometimes, right? Sometimes we can even be individually conflicted with things. It's going to happen in a church because when we look at churches, they have people in them. And when you bring more than one person together, we're going to have conflict. It is not only normal, it is good. And I know we mentioned that there was something that has happened in the past. I want to also say that how we engage in it can really help us spur growth and move us forward in a really healthy way. When people with different views come to the table and work with me on something, what we create together is better than what I could do on my own. And I always remind people that everyone comes to the table with themselves and they're going to be unique. They have their own values, their own views, their own ego. Good acronym for ego is edging God out. Fortunately, I do it all the time. Their own fears, their own strengths, their own barriers, and so much more. So I know, again, we've got some conflict that we've needed to work through as a congregation. We also want to think about, conflict is something that is going to continue to be a part of the life of the church because it is normal. And how do we continue to use it and engage in it in healthy ways? So for conflict management, we look at 4 statements. 2 of them are negatively framed, so they have this asterisk right next to them. With negatively framed, we want disagreements. So the first statement, there is a disturbing amount of conflict in our congregation. You had almost half of your respondents are on the fence. 23% disagreed, which we want disagreements. We still have some agreements here. Again, you have quite a few on the fence as we move through this and beyond, but we still have some people who strongly agree that there's a disturbing amount of conflict in the congregation. Number 2, problems between groups in this church are usually resolved through mutual effort. We've got some disagreements with that. We have a lot of people on the fence. 20% agreeing and 5% strongly agreeing. Among most of our members, there is a healthy tolerance of differing opinions and beliefs. This one is really important for you all as a group that is theologically diverse on where you stand with things. So really making sure that how do we continue to invest in making sure we've got that healthy tolerance of differing opinions and beliefs. 52% were on the fence with that, 28% agreed, and 13% strongly agreed. So we've got quite a few of agreements in there. But again, how do we continue to take that 42% of tending to agree and moving them on over so they say, absolutely, we've got that healthy tolerance. Number 4, there's frequently a small group of members that opposes what the majority wants to do. So we have about 15% here disagreeing, and we have 27% agreeing. And then you've got quite a few people on the fence. You have some groups with some different experiences with this one. So this continues to be an area, again, to invest in as a congregation. How are we continuing to learn skills and engage each other in ways when we disagree? Any questions on this one?
Hi, Elizabeth. What's the overall index score on the conflict management?
Yeah, that's your overall index for your benchmarking against other churches. So the overall index for this one, which is these 4 different questions together, is at, what was that? 14%. So your scores are stronger than 14% of the other churches that we've worked with. Does that answer your question adequately?
It does, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for asking that. All right, governance. So there are 4 things that we look at for governance. And governance is really, how are we engaging with vestry? What does our relationship with vestry look like? Where's our trust with vestry? When they answer leaders, they are really thinking about your governance board. The leaders of our church show a genuine concern to know what people are thinking when decisions need to be made. Again, you don't have much disagreement here. You have quite a few people on the fence who are watching and waiting to see what happens. And this is a good time to use the CAT. When you present this information out to the congregation, this is what we heard, and here's how we're going to use this information moving forward as a leadership team. That is a place to continue to build up kind of that trust in leadership. 32% agreed and almost 16% strongly agreed. The same small group of people seem to make most of the important decisions in our church. The operative word here is same. We know that we can't have a large vestry. It'd be really hard to get things done, but it's, do we bring new people on? Do people come off? This is a negatively framed question, so we want disagreements. We've got 7% about in the disagreements area. Again, a lot of people on the fence. 23% agreed and 20% strongly agreed. In important decisions in our church, adequate opportunity for consideration of different approaches is usually provided. We've got a little bit of disagreements here. Again, a lot of people on the fence, 24% agreed and 9% strongly agreed. The last one, persons who serve as leaders in our church are representative of the membership. We have a little bit of disagreements. We've got 53% on the fence, 35% agreed, and 7% strongly agreed. So a lot of movable people in your data that are continuing to kind of watch and see what direction we're going in. Does that make sense? Any questions on this?
Yeah, Elizabeth, this is I was concerned by this. You know, particularly as the guy who's trying to do the transition, I've been trying to make sure that everybody realizes that we want to hear from everybody. And of course, Holy Cow is one of the ways of doing it. But for your information, we do have a three-year term on the vestry, and we rotate on and off every 3 years. You'd think that would set up for a better feeling that the leaders represented. But of course, part of it is that every year when it comes to getting new vestry members, it's a bit difficult to get people to be willing to step up and get involved in the commitment. And so I don't know how to approach this, you know, as a member of the vestry.
So this is not an uncommon, your experience is not unique. You're not the only one church that is experiencing this. So a couple of things. One, it can be about relationship building. Most all church governing boards usually have a 2 to 3 year term where at some point you step down. It's about making sure that we're really clear and almost over communicate that transition, who's leaving, who's coming on. We know that you can put some communication out there, and then when you talk about it, people are like, well, I never heard of that. So you cannot communicate enough around transitions and who your leaders are. Even having them stand up, you know, once a month at worship service, like just a reminder, here, all of our vestry members, or doing something along those lines to make them physically visible in the church. And then also making sure there's a good shoulder rub. I don't know if you're a church that wears name tags. If you are, making sure we write vestry on the name tag so people are able to identify who you are. If we have people who are coming in that are newer, that are not cradle Episcopalians, they may not fully understand the church structure too. And so making sure that we over explain that as well. What I would like to point out to you for your one of your top priorities for that 35 to 64, was that strengthen the process by which members are called and equipped for ministry and leadership. It is really hard when we do that big shout out of we need people to consider joining vestry, is very different than seeking people out who have some skill sets that you see in them that you think that they might be good, and to consider joining and maybe even having ways for them to learn more where it doesn't feel like there's that pressure there. What we know about volunteer management post-COVID is the big ask doesn't work like it used to. Individual asks that you tailor to people based on their skills and their gifts tends to deliver better outcomes. I don't know if that's a good enough, like if that's enough for you, if that makes sense, or if we want to talk about that a little bit more. There may be someone who would be great on vestry who maybe just needs a little extra breath of like believing in them, right? Because that can be intimidating too. Any other thoughts or questions? I see some conversation.
This is Judith Hunt, and I think that, it isn't really spoken about being on the vestry. I just came off the vestry, and then the elections are coming up, and it's the month of January, or it's the very end of December, and people start saying, oh, who's gonna run for vestry? And then people are approached like it's a fire sale, like, come on, we need people right now. Instead of people, talking over a longer period of time to their friends saying, I think you would be good on vestry, and this is what it's like, and this is what we're doing, and that sort of thing. And you're welcome to come and see a meeting. So nobody is really sort of talking about it during the year. It's just when the meeting is about to come up, and I think that's kind of tough for people to say, I've got a busy life, and okay, yeah, sure, I'll be on vestry, but I don't really know what it is, kind of a thing.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And, and it's also a hard time of year to have those conversations with people because it's a very busy time of year for people. And when you're busy, you don't look at your whole year saying, oh, I have time generally these months. So you look at what you're doing right now and say, oh no, I'm too busy. I think the more you can talk about it, even creating an annual calendar for vestry leadership of this time of year we do this time of year, and in the summer we start having conversations. We start talking in May about being on vestry, but we also communicate out about it year round so they know what decisions are being made, who your vestry members are, maybe even having them pop up and say something and worship, just check in, this is what we're doing on a monthly basis can be really helpful. Relationships do so much, right? Relationships can really cause a lot of healing to happen. When I have a relationship with people on vestry and they make a decision that I question, I'm going to say, well, but I know them, right? And so there's so much more grace there because I know these people. So for you all really thinking about how do we talk about it more? How do we celebrate the work of the vestry more too? You guys work incredibly hard. So let's maybe take some time too to celebrate some of the work that's being done and share that with the congregation. It doesn't all have to be here's what we got to do next, but even celebrating the work that we did. Heck, you might want to tell them we sat with Holy Cow for a very long time to go over the data. But just really making sure that we communicate that out, to your point, as much as possible and year round. Because being on this leadership board is a commitment, and people need to hear and see what you're doing. That might be inspiring for them too. Any other thoughts or questions on this one? Spiritual vitality. So these are the only my or I questions that we ask in the tool. There are 5 of them. The 5th one is negatively framed. So the first one, my spiritual experiences often impact the way I look at life. Now let's look at your raw scores before we look at the benchmarking. So you had 5% disagreeing, but you had almost 18% in the fence, 31% agreed, but look at this, 46% strongly agreed. Now you benchmarked in the typical or average arena, but when you look at your actual scores, look at how many people were in the agreeance camp for this number 1. Number 2, my spirituality is really the basis of my whole approach to life. You've got a little bit of disagreement, so that 5% again, 7% tend to disagree, almost 30% tending to agree, 34% agreed, and 23% strongly agreed. So even though we pop down in the benchmarking, it's in part because we have a lot of people kind of on the fence, but you still have a lot of people agreeing and strongly agreeing. I experienced the presence of God in my life. Disagreements goes down a little bit here. We've got 15% on the fence, 36% agreed, and almost 44% strongly agreed. I work to connect my faith to all other aspects of my life. Again, a little bit of disagreements, 38% on the fence, 29% agreeing, and 27% strongly agreeing. And this last one, although my faith is important to me, I feel there are much other things more pressing in my life right now. So we do have that disagreements that we're looking for. And then we also have quite a few people on the fence, 8% agreeing and almost 1% strongly agreeing. One of the things that we know can be really helpful for paraclete cultures is to talk about where they've experienced God in their life recently. Or if you do a history review of the church, start 30 years ago, who was in charge, what were we working on, what did the transition look like, and even talking about where God was in your history, especially when we went through hard things, can really do a lot to continue to unify us as a community. All right, the next one is readiness for ministry. So there are 5 statements that we look at. They're all positively framed. I'm going to draw your on the fencers right here. So the first one is about, does our church do a good job helping each member understand that he or she is called to ministry? We have a little bit of disagreements, a lot of people on the fence, but 25% agreed and almost 7% strongly agreed. Our church prepares our members for ministry by helping them discern their gifts. Again, we had about 60% on the fence, 18% agreed, and 4% strongly agreed. This is one where your older population had really strong scores. So again, when we think about those intergenerational relationships, how can we tap into the strength of that group that really felt strong here to maybe mentor or support or even teach or put a training together for the other populations? And then you've got some natural relationships built in. Our church provides opportunities for members to engage in active ministry within the church and to the world. Number 3, our church does a good job supporting persons in ministry by reminding them they are making a difference. So again, we have a lot of people on the fence here, 33% agreed and 16% strongly agreed. We do not celebrate each other enough in the church because we know we're called to do the work. God's called us to do the work. We do the work and we say we don't need a thank you, but man, sometimes it's nice to know that you're doing something that really impacts people in a positive way. So how can we continue to foster a sense of gratitude and acknowledgement? Because when you're halfway up a mountain, sometimes we look at how much farther we have to go to get to the peak, and we don't pause and say, wow, look how far we came, right? The last one, in our congregation, lay people work with the priest in charge and leading and planning the worship services. And you guys are almost out of the typical range and into the high range with that, with the level of engagement that we're in. Education. So we know that this is one that was our 3rd priority as an overall congregation. We have some longing here, and that is reflected in our scores. What I will tell you though, when we look at scores like this, you need to then have other conversations with the congregation, because we don't want to start putting programming together without knowing what is the longing within the congregation. So we have 3 statements here. Our members understand they have a spiritual responsibility for lifelong learning and formation. They provide opportunities for education formation in a variety of ways, so I can find one that fits my complex lifestyle. And the last one, our church provides high quality education that's appropriate to every age and stage of life. If we decide to look at doing something different with Christian education, we need to ask a couple of questions of the members of the congregation or the congregation as a whole. If we're providing Christian education in a way that really is meeting needs, what's the curriculum? What are we teaching? Right? Because that's different than from different groups. When is it happening? Where is it happening? Is it happening out in the community? Is it happening on Zoom? Is it happening in the church? Are we going to people's homes? Right? And are you committed to coming? Otherwise, we put new Christian education things together. We buy chocolate chip muffins. We think we're all ready, and we eat the muffins by ourselves because we're not engaged in the curriculum people were interested in. It's not at a time that they can come, and they said they wanted it, but maybe they weren't committed to coming, right? So really make sure if you do anything different with Christian ed, that we really dig into those questions, because you don't want to spend time kind of chasing your tail. Does that make sense? I've heard too many stories from churches where they had scores, they're like, we had to do something, so we put stuff together and it didn't go anywhere. So really making sure that it meets needs. Worship and music. So there's 2 statements that we look at. The first, the music at our church is outstanding in quality and appropriate and style to our congregation. I will tell you, this score in benchmarking is one of the most competitive we have in this tool. And look at how high your score is. The worship services at our church are exceptional in quality and spiritual content. And again, we've got a little bit of disagreement. So we've got some people on the fence, but 32% agreed and 20% strongly agreed. If we are going to look at, as a congregation, doing anything different with worship, we've seen our flexibility scores. Change needs to be incremental. It needs to take time. And so you'll have to think through, if we want to do anything to change worship, how do we do it in an incremental way so these people's needs are being met a little bit more, and these people who strongly agree that they like it how it is don't move into the 10 degree camp, right? So this is going to be kind of a delicate, if we do anything different, making sure we're very intentional and incremental, because change is not something we embrace wholeheartedly, right? It needs to be done with time and purpose. Your overall worship scores are in the mid 70th percentile. All right, here are your financial page. There are 2 different charts here. The top one is around what people reported as their income. And then the next one is what they reported as contributions. Your average percent of income given is 1.58%. You're in the 20th percentile for rank. Sometimes we know with churches, if we've had kind of a break in some decision making, or we're struggling with something in the church, sometimes people withhold their giving as a form of kind of communicating how they feel about that. But this is an area of growth for you all. And keep in mind too, look at this spread. So not only you're diverse with theological perspective, you're also diverse with income. And really being aware and sensitive to that. Here is your demographic page. So 65% of your respondents are over 65. Here's that 2% under 34. Quite a few people here in the middle. Look at all the people that have come in the last 2 years. We've had quite a bit of people come in. Not every church can say that. You also have quite the spread here too with how much people are driving to get to you all. You've got quite a few people in walking distance, and then you've got people who are really driving to get to you. And I'm sure they are passing by other churches to come to your doorstep. Here is your attendance and attendance trend. I will point out you've got about 1/4 of your respondents who live alone. When we live alone and we're over 65, or if we live alone and we're under 65, pastoral care can be top of mind and making sure, will someone show up if I need them, right? Look at your education rate too. You guys are a highly educated congregation. 57% of your respondents have a graduate degree. In fact, if you go to the next page, down on this household chart, you are at the 92nd percentile for education in our benchmarking.
Wow.
Think of all the skills. I mean, that's a lot of education. Think of all the unique skills and diverse skills you're going to have in your congregation, and how can we leverage them? Tenure, you're in the mid 50th percentile, a little bit higher. We do not want to be at the 100th percentile for tenure because that means we're not bringing anyone new in, right? Here's where we're at for daily devotionals, value of involvement, involvement beyond worship. The distance to church for you all right here is a little tricky. Overall in the benchmarking, you're in the mid, about 16th percentile. But that's in part because you have so many people who are really close to the church. You also have a lot of people who are really far from the church too. So this one right here is kind of, the benchmarking is important, but just keep in mind too that you've got diverse group of people with their distances. All right, transition module. So there are 8 things that we ask for the transition module. The top one, it could take a number of months to complete a pastoral transition. During that time, I tend to be. One person said much less involved, 4% said less involved, 62% said about the same, 25% said more involved, 8% said much more involved, and I know that they are not all on this call. So as we think about volunteer engagement, moving forward, there are people who've said that they want to be much more involved. How do we give them space, comfort, and the on-ramp to get involved in the ways that they can contribute? The next question, there are a number of additional responsibilities that may arise during the pastoral transition. Please indicate your level of availability to help with additional responsibilities. So 6% said much less available, 8% said less available, 45% said about the same, 32% said more available, and 8% said much more available. So you got a pool of people who are willing to lean in and help. If you pop down here in the benchmarking, when it comes to availability and willingness to help out, you guys are almost at the 80th percentile and the mid 60th percentile. So we've got people who are leaning in. We want to make sure we engage. There are a number of additional financial costs during a pastoral transition. Please indicate your anticipated level of giving. 2% said lower, 77% said about the same, 21% said higher. During the pastoral transition, I'm thinking about exploring other churches, which by the way is completely normal. 5% agreed with that. You have some people on the fence, but you had a lot of disagreements and strongly disagree. I believe the leadership at our church needs to be more representative of the congregation, and we have diverse responses on this, right? We're kind of got a spread for how people view that. I am comfortable with the timing of the pastoral transition. I feel that it's time for a change. We've got 4% disagreeing. We've got 30% on the fence, 40% agreed, and 26% strongly agreed. The last question, In the future, I believe the church should continue in the same overall direction it's taken in the recent past. Again, look at the number of people on the fence. I believe the next pastor we call should have approximately the same skills and responsibilities. And we've got a little bit of disagreements. 40% are on the fence, watching and waiting to see what we do next before they make that decision. And then 45% agree. So that's what your transitional report says, module says. And then the next one is on your interim module. When you think about the overall strength of our church now compared to the strength of the church just prior to the resignation announcement of your former pastor, you would say the congregation is 5% said weak, much weaker, 19% said weaker, 23% said about the same, 37% said stronger, and 16% said much stronger. And once again, we have that spread of experiences within the church, which has kind of been a theme a little bit for your data. The leadership is doing a good job communicating with the congregation during our transition to a new pastor. So we pop down here. We've got some on the fencers. I'll draw them out. 38% agreed and 24% strongly agreed. At this point, I believe the congregation has adjusted well to the loss of our former pastor. 4% disagreed. We've got some on the fencers here, 34% agreed and 31% strongly agreed. I am comfortable with the pace of our transition process, including our search for a new pastor. So we've got 23% disagreeing. We've got, again, some on the fence, and 30% agreed and 10% strongly agreed. I believe the members of the congregation are being well utilized to help with our transition to a new pastor. We have quite a few people on the fence with that, leaning more with 10 to agree, 36% agreed, and 14% strongly agreed. And the last, if the search committee were to discover a new pastor for us today, I believe we are ready to follow his or her leadership. We've got some disagreements. We've got some people on the fence, 32% agreed and 16% strongly agreed. So you did ask some supplemental questions that are unique to your church. They are pie charts. You don't necessarily need me to help you understand them, but they are there for you to look at. They're a breakout of your worship service, and then the unique questions that you all drafted regarding programming that people are involved in. So at this point, this is your overall interpretation of the data. I will open this up to extra questions people might have. Do you want me to talk about how to present this information to the congregation? Would that be helpful?
Say it again, Bob.
Yes, please.
You do not do a really long report like I just did. So you'll lose people. You want to keep it short and sweet. Well, short, meaningful, informative, and sweet. We usually recommend, if you can do it on a Sunday after worship, if food can be involved, there's something that happens when we break bread together, right? And so if you can do a potluck, do something where people consume some food together, there's that community. And I know you have an 8 o'clock and a 10:30. So then we're trying to get the 8 o'clock people there, which can be a bit of a challenge. But just try to think about, should it be in the middle of the two worship services, or should we have it in an afternoon, and really try to get people there with the idea of some fellowship, and maybe if there's someone who makes some sort of special dessert that everybody at the church loves, and usually there's that like one thing, think about how we kind of entice people and use it to do some relationship building. You want to have your members of vestry there and your transition team. So this is again a time for leaders to be seen, if you can be there, and to kind of do that shoulder rub, right? And to kind of welcome people, to connect with them. So this is how I usually recommend doing a congregational presentation. We start with something grounding. It can be scripture, because I heard scripture is a good thing to include into church presentations. The other thing you can do, though, is to really get people centered on why. What do they love about Trinity? So you can ask, you can do grounding scripture that you weave throughout. You can also open up with and get one of those big white write-on boards that almost every church has with an easel and say, what do you love about Trinity Episcopal? And it can't be I love it because it's an Episcopalian church, right? But what do you love about Trinity Episcopal Church? What's one of your favorite memories about Trinity Episcopal? Or why do you continue to come here, right? So get people thinking about what they love about your church. There's a reason they come to your church. So we want to make sure we're getting their eyes off of the things that maybe we don't like and thinking about what we love and our why for being here, right? Then going over what energy and satisfaction is and where you guys are on the map. You don't have to do a breakout of all the reports that might lose people, but just say, hey, this is where we're at in the recovery quadrant. We're getting kind of close up to this area, but we've got some work to do, and we know that. Talking a little bit about what your drivers are for energy and satisfaction, and the fact that they're a little bit reflective of how diverse you are as a congregation. You only had one driver for energy because different groups are looking for different things. What are some of the critical success factors that we are going to work on or we need to work on? You don't have to show them that long list. You can do the buckets that I put together for you. But really kind of talking about here are some of the things that we as a church need to work on during this transition time. And by the way, this work is not just vestry work. It is congregational work. It is the community of Christ work, right? And so it's about how can we all come together because there might be some skills in the congregation that can help with getting some of these critical success factors done. It's one of the things I love about working with churches. There's always somebody who can do something, right? Who knows how to do the thing. What are some of your top priorities? And then bring up the fact that all of ours, we didn't have any high or low. We are all just kind of in that average range, but we have some things that we want to do. Talk about church culture with the slides that I gave you around performance culture, not performance, but paraclete culture. And then your overall performance dashboard. I wouldn't go into each of those performance indices, but the overall dashboard and where we're at. And then your next steps, right? What's the transition team's next steps? How are we going to use this information to help guide decision-making? Have you guys done or are you considering doing listening sessions or holy conversations?
We did some focus groups, some small focus groups, and then we're compiling that qualitative data and sort of what the notes are and
Okay.
priorities we're talking about in these groups.
So maybe even adding in as you present the data, here's also what we heard from our focus groups. Did they line up with what you heard tonight?
I think so. I don't have all those notes in front of me.
Yeah.
Steve's nodding his head in the back, so I'm gonna say yes.
Okay, good. And so that's always helpful to say what we heard from the data and what we heard from the focus groups really lines up, and that gives us a really clear vision of the road we have ahead together. And then, I always like to leave things with some appreciative inquiry. So one of the things that I like doing is asking people to take a moment and think of somebody that they're really grateful for in the church. And it cannot be staff or clergy. I mean, we always love the rector or priest in charge, right? But we need to think about somebody in the church that we are grateful for and what they do, and have them take a moment and think about that and why. What's the why that they're grateful for? And then say, all right, you have 2 weeks to send that person a text, an email, a card, do something nice for them and tell them why what they've done has been meaningful to you. We won't know if you did it, but God will know. And we can feel that when we come together. That might be a good way to end the meeting because it has people leaving thinking about ways to show gratitude to each other. Is that helpful?
Yeah, very much. Thank you.
Yeah. Keep it to 30 minutes, maybe 45. Leave space for questions. Don't play this recording and pop popcorn. All right. Are there any questions for me?
Elizabeth. So when you're looking at each of these indices and you talk about the questions that are uppermost in our minds and our percentages, and I'm curious about this fact that you're saying that the people that tend to agree and the people that tend to disagree, that you lump those people on the fence. Is that correct?
Yes.
So why didn't you put like the people that tend to agree with the agree side and the people that tend to disagree with the disagree side?
Because they're lukewarm with how they feel. So what we found from years of doing this is they're kind of lukewarm, they're movable. When we think about, that question around a friendly atmosphere prevails among the members of our church, we put the tend to disagree and tend to agree on the fence, people in the middle, because when you think about what you want to that response, when we come to church together and that friendly atmosphere prevailing, we want people to say absolutely or yes. When they tend to agree, they've got this lukewarm feeling, they can easily shift to tend to disagree, which then can even put them in the disagreements camp if they have certain experiences that move them rather quickly because they're not firm with where they stand with it. So that's just what we found from years of working with people, that the tend to agree people are movable. And we've seen that when intentional work is done in churches, when we come back and redo the CAT several years later, those people move. Does that help?
Yeah, yes, thank you. And,
Yeah.
and the other point that I have is that these graphs at the bottom of each of these indices, so that's us in, what were you saying, 200 and some odd churches that you've done. So all of the surveys that you've done.
Yes.
So those graphs at the bottom are not our church specifically. It's where we lie in the whole, your big picture, right?
Yes. So
Right.
it's,
So they're separate entities. They're not, because I think that's a little confusing that people look at this page and they think, oh, you're talking about our church. And here are these graphs at the bottom. But the numbers, like if you look at our percentages, like on this question, 1 or 2 or 3, when you compare them to the bottom, that's not where we fall, because your graphs are really about the big picture, all 200 and some odd churches you've done.
no, it's where you guys all are in comparison to the 2,800 other churches we've worked with.
2,800. Oh gosh, okay.
Yeah. And 33% of them are Episcopalian, if that helps.
Okay.
But so it helps if your score, so when you look at your hospitality score, when you're at, 30% on something, it means that 70% of other churches have a stronger score in that area than you do. And the benchmarking is important because we know, one, that people shop around for churches and have those different experiences, but we can look at what are the trends in churches when they have certain scores. When churches have a stronger score, as I said earlier with hospitality, that's where we see growth happen. But also you can feel it in those churches. Yeah, so if that helps to answer your question or provide some clarity.
So can you answer this question that Bob asked you from this person in our congregation, Shar Burgess?
Yeah.
Too early in the discussion.
Yeah, so as I said earlier, when we talk about doing outreach and growth, hospitality is key. Making sure that we have done the internal things that we need to do to make sure that we are internally healthy. So we're handling the conflict that we've experienced in healthy ways, that we've got that strong trust and leadership. So all of those internal pieces are step one. I know we always think step one is doing some outreach and connecting with people, but step one is really making sure that we are investing in the internal health of the congregation. So that's the part one. So that's that slide when I talked about growth, that's kind of what I was talking about earlier. Once we get to that place, we see churches start to grow naturally when when people are excited to come to church and they feel that connection, they will bring people with them. The other thing that you can do is look at, so once we do the internal health and we're where we need to be as the healthiest church that we can possibly be, when we start to think about growth, how do we connect with community organizations? How are we providing ways for people to serve alongside us? Especially with the millennials and the younger generations, inviting them to come to worship might be not the first way they want to engage with your church. Maybe the first way they want to engage with your church is doing some activities to serve others, doing kind of community service-based engagements, and really making sure we have that strong community presence as a congregation. And then what are we doing with our branding? So, and we've all seen this when we see groups of congregations go out and do work, and they have those shirts that they're wearing, and you know where they're from, and you see them having fun together. They're on stage, meaning that when they're interacting with each other out in the community, they're really providing that presence where you think, I want to be involved in that. So I know those are pretty simple things to say. They're a little bit more complicated to do. Is there more that you want me to talk about with that?
I have one question about the benchmarks.
Yes.
Those, how many of those surveys were done post-COVID? Or were they all the last 10 years or the last 5, 4, 3?
Last 6 years. And then we have a separate COVID generator that we occasionally throw data into to make sure things aren't moving more than we saw. But post-COVID, we really only saw the data move in 2 places. So if I took your data and put it in what we call our COVID generator of the churches that we've done post-lockdown, things wouldn't move much at all, maybe just a couple of percentages.
The other question is in the congregational presentation, since obviously I'm going to be involved in that. You mentioned some of the things that sounded like the stuff we've done. The stuff that our diocese recommended and what we've done, we already had a homecoming day, and then we had a story day. And the story day, I mean, this room was covered with papers and what everybody's done, and Linda who was here, she collated all that stuff, and she and Jerry Mill ran that. It was great. So is there a need to do that kind of part of that again, or we, having done it, they just remind the people that we did it and go forward, right?
Yeah, so that's wonderful that you've already done those things. It's wonderful that we've already had some focus groups. It's wonderful that we've done a history. These are all really good things that you all have done. So maybe reminding people we did them, because sometimes people get busy and they might have missed church for a couple of weeks, and then they'll forget that we did the thing. So it might be good to remind everyone that these are the intentional things that we are doing as your leadership team to make sure that we are really deeply listening, and that we're also celebrating where we've come from. So you do not need to do them again. I do think you want to remind everyone that you did them, and maybe even thank people who were part of getting that done, because again, we're kind of showing that space of gratitude.
As part of that,
Oh, you muted. You muted again. I'm so sorry.
Okay. Where was I before Siri started to interrupt now in my ears? And one more thing, and of course it went away. I think there's a thought. Yeah. I think everybody wants to go home. But
I know.
This has been a wonderful, wonderful presentation, and I thank you. And I just want to make sure nobody in the room wants to say anything more, and nobody online wants to say anything more. No? Well, I think, thank you so much, and we will. Oh, the question I did want to ask was, when you send us the PowerPoint, is that going to be, obviously we're not going to show the PowerPoint to everybody, but there might be a slide or two we might want to show. We would be able to pull that out in a live fashion.
Yes. So it is your point to do as you would like. You can pull, pages out as they're helpful to you. You can show it to whomever you would like to. It's really there to be a service to you all. And one of the reasons I do them is so that, because I try to think if I was on the other side and getting this information, I would want to have something like that. So yeah, it's there to use at your discretion. Okay, well then, if there are no other questions, I'm gonna close with scripture. Maybe, if it's gonna pull up. There we go. All right. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. And of course, that's Jeremiah, who I find myself quoting Jeremiah a lot recently. If you have any questions, I always tell people I have the best questions a week after a conversation, right? Sometimes 2 weeks after. Robert, when I send you everything, you're then gonna have my email address. And if somebody is driving down the road a week from now and they're like, oh my gosh, I wish I had asked, you can have Robert send me an email. I don't disappear after this, which is always good, right? Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. Thank you for hanging in there for almost 3 whole hours. I love that. That's great. And have a wonderful evening at this point.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.